Welcome to Prospective Doctors MCAT Podcast, brought to you by Med School Coach. Each week, Sam breaks down the highest yield MCAT topics so you can score as high as possible on test day.
Hello and welcome to Prospective Doctors MCAT Basics with your host Sam Smith. The goal of this podcast is to cover the highest yield topics on the MCAT and provide you with some sort of insight into the questions that the MCAT really likes to ask. This podcast covers sleep and circadian rhythms. In the first part of the podcast, I cover some of the biological and physiological concepts regarding sleep. I'm going to talk about sleep stages, and then I'll get into some of the biology of circadian rhythms. And then in the second part of the podcast, I'll get into more of the psychology-based concepts of sleep. That's going to be things like sleep and dream theories, sleep disorders, and the effects of drugs on sleep. And as you probably picked up from that description, this is a twofer. There are going to be two MCAT sections in this one podcast because this podcast is going to cover material that is on the biochem section and also the psych-soc section. I hope you find this podcast helpful in your studies, and good luck to those of you who are taking the test shortly, especially those of you who shout me out on Twitter. So as I said in the intro, the first part of this podcast is going to be more biology and physiology based, and then I'm going to get into some of the psychology. So let me start out here by talking about some of the parts in the brain that are involved in sleep. And I want to say before I get into this that there are many structures in the brain involved to some capacity in sleep. I picked out 5 that are especially important to sleep, but just keep in mind that this is not like an exhaustive list. This is just 5 of the most important structures for sleep. So first, we have the hypothalamus. And if you think back to the nervous system podcast, the hypothalamus is the connection between the nervous system and the endocrine system. And essentially through nervous innervation and the production of releasing hormones, it signals other glands to produce hormones. So for instance, the hypothalamus can signal the adrenal gland and tell it to produce cortisol.
Hello, adrenal gland. This is your hypothalamus speaking. Please produce cortisol.
And more specifically, there is a little bundle of neurons in the hypothalamus called the suprachiasmatic nucleus, which plays a very important role in the circadian rhythms that I will discuss later. So just keep in mind, inside the hypothalamus, there's this very small nucleus called the suprachiasmatic nucleus, which is very important for sleep and circadian rhythms. The second part of the brain that is involved in sleep or is very important for sleep is the brainstem. And the brainstem controls basic bodily functions. In sleep, it plays a role in producing GABA or gamma aminobutyric acid, which acts to reduce the activity of arousal centers in the hypothalamus and in the brainstem. And this also helps relax our muscles during REM sleep. As I'll get into, during REM sleep, we are dreaming, and if our muscles weren't relaxed, we'd essentially act out our dreams, which would be bad for us and others around us while we were sleeping. The third part of the brain specifically involved in sleep is the pineal gland, and the pineal gland produces melatonin, which is a hormone that is very important for sleep, and that I'm sure you're probably familiar with. But I'll get into more of that in detail when I talk about the circadian rhythms. The fourth area of the brain that is involved in sleep, or most involved in sleep, is the amygdala. And the amygdala is involved in processing emotions and is very active during REM sleep. Then lastly, we have the basal forebrain, and this is near the front bottom of the brain. So that's all to say that the basal forebrain can release acetylcholine, which makes us feel awake, but this acetylcholine release can be blocked by adenosine, which makes us feel sleepy. And as you'll actually see later in the podcast, I'll talk about caffeine, and caffeine is actually an adenosine antagonist. All right, so those are the 5 most involved parts of the brain in sleep. Again, that's the hypothalamus, the brainstem, the pineal gland, the amygdala, and the basal forebrain. All right, so the next thing I want to talk about here are the different sleep stages, and this is probably one of the most important things for the MCAT from this podcast. And I'll start out by talking about the different stages of consciousness before I get into sleep, so you can kind of understand what consciousness is before getting into those different sleep stages. So when I talk about consciousness, I'm not talking about consciousness in terms of awareness by the mind of itself and of the world. I'm not talking about you being able to say, I'm conscious because I know I'm a human and I know I'm living on planet Earth. That type of consciousness is different from the consciousness I'm talking about here, which is the level of awareness of one's surroundings. The most basic level, there are two states of consciousness, right? There is conscious and there's unconscious. And in between these two states of consciousness, there is a spectrum of other states. So you can have a state in which you are hypnotized or a state of hypnosis. You can be meditating. You can have a state of decreased consciousness. And this is when a person appears to be fully conscious, but they do not respond to their environment. So this would be something like a catatonic state where the person is awake, but you snap your finger in front of their face and say their name and stuff, and they just keep staring ahead and have no reaction. So this is all to say that states of consciousness exist on a continuum. You can be fully awake, fully alert. You can be in a coma, or you can be anywhere in between. On the other hand, when we talk about sleep, there are discrete, well-defined stages within sleep that we move back and forth between. It's a cycle, and I'll go through that cycle and describe each of these steps. But first, I want to talk about how scientists and physicians measure sleep, or what they measure during sleep in order to determine these sleep stages. Scientists and physicians use three main measurements to assess their subjects as they sleep. The first one is called electroencephalography, or EEG. The second is called electromyography, or EMG. And then the last is called electrooculography, or EOG. And these three measurements are fairly similar. EEG measures electrical activity in the brain using small electrodes that you attach to the scalp, and it detects activity of large groups of neurons, usually in the cerebral cortex. And what this is primarily measuring is actually postsynaptic potential, which is just changes in membrane potential of the postsynaptic terminal of a chemical synapse, or the change in membrane potential of the terminal that is actually receiving and binding to neurotransmitter. So again, this is not measuring action potentials, which is where I think some people get a bit confused. It's not measuring action potentials, it's measuring postsynaptic potential. And if you've ever seen an EEG diagram or an EEG wave, you'll know that these are actually waves with varying amplitude, wavelength, and frequency. And these changes in amplitude, wavelength, and frequency that you can observe on an EEG are important for distinguishing between the different sleep stages. And I'll get into what exactly that is, or what these changes are as we go into the different stages of sleep. An EMG measures and records electrical activity of skeletal muscles. So this is very similar to an EEG in that electrodes are placed on the skin and then you're looking at these waves that are produced. But for sleep studies, these electrodes are placed actually on the chin. And I was kind of curious as to why you would place these electrodes on the chin, and it seems like an odd place. I couldn't really find a straight answer. To me, it seems like that's kind of the standard, and maybe it's just that the first person to do it placed them on the chin, and from then on, they used that as a reference to kind of make sure everything's working okay. I don't know, but the EMG is done by placing the electrodes on the chin. And the point of an EMG is to measure atonia. So atonia is the inhibition of muscle contraction, and that's seen during REM sleep. So that's basically where muscles relax and do not contract, and so you can capture that using an EMG. Last but not least is the EOG, and the EOG measures and records electrical activity of the eye, which corresponds then to eye movements. And so this is important for capturing REM sleep, and if you don't know, REM stands for rapid eye movement sleep. So that's pretty self-explanatory as to why you would want to measure the movement of the eye when someone was falling asleep, which is it allows you to distinguish REM sleep from non-REM sleep. So with that, let's get into the different sleep stages. So we have 4 different sleep stages: N1, N2, N3, and REM, which stands for rapid eye movement. So let's go through these steps in the order that they would occur. And I want to start with a non-sleep stage, and that's going to be being awake. So when you are awake, you are producing very characteristic waves on the EEG. And these waves are called alpha waves. And I just remember this by grouping the A's together. So alpha awake. I just remember when you're awake, you're producing these alpha waves in your brain. And then when you get into the N1 sleep stage, which is the first sleep stage, you are changing over from being awake to being asleep. And during this short stage, which lasts only a few minutes, your heart rate, your breathing, and your eye movements begin to slow down, which are captured on the EOG. In addition to that, your muscles start to relax with only occasional twitches that are captured on the EMG. And then your brain actually starts producing what are called theta waves, which just indicate a decrease in brain activity. And these theta waves are seen on the EEG. And in this stage of sleep, N1, you can have what are called hypnagogic hallucinations. And according to this paper I read by Collerton et al. In a journal called Schizophrenia Bulletin, hypnagogic hallucinations are, quote, involuntary, spontaneous, of varying emotionality, and are found in up to 70% of the general population. Visual, auditory, and tactile sensations are most commonly reported. Visual phenomena typically consist of kaleidoscopically changing phenomena such as geometric patterns, shapes, and light flashes. Images involving animals, people, and faces in scenes also occur and are described as lifelike, highly detailed, and colorful. Voices and other sounds, like phones, doorbells, music, occur less commonly, end quote. And I've never experienced any hypnagogic hallucinations that I'm aware of or that I remember, so I thought I should kind of look up and see what some people experience. So hypnagogic hallucination is kind of what it sounds like. It's these hallucinations that occur as you're falling asleep. Sometimes, though, I do get a sensation where I'm falling right when I'm falling asleep. I'm assuming this is in N1, and what this is called is hypnagogic jerk. And what's interesting is there's an evolutionary perspective that says that this is an old primate reflex. And it essentially says that the body is misinterpreting muscle relaxation as falling out of a tree, and hence you get that falling feeling and you suddenly jerk awake. Now, in N2, the next stage of sleep, heart rate, breathing, and eye movements slow down even further, muscles relax even more, and more theta waves are produced by the brain. The interesting thing that happens in N2 in terms of the EEG is you start to see what are called sleep spindles and K complexes. And these are basically short bursts of electrical activity. And if you look at an EEG with sleep spindles, you'll see that they have a very, very short wavelength. So they look like they're these really tight kind of packed together waves. Then you look at K complexes, and they look like essentially these theta waves, but they have a larger amplitude. So I recommend you just go kind of Google an image of a sleep spindle and a K complex to understand what they look like. The other thing I'd understand about N2 is that it is the longest sleep stage and lasts somewhere between 30 to 60 minutes. During N3, your heartbeat and breathing rate slow to their lowest levels during all of the sleep stages, and the brain starts to produce this new type of wave that's called a delta wave. And these are even slower or lower in frequency than the theta waves, indicating even further decreased brain activity. And N3 lasts between 20 and 40 minutes and is the deepest stage of sleep. And this is also the stage of sleep where sleepwalking and sleep talking occur. And honestly, I'm not really sure if sleepwalking is real. It's one of those things you hear about, but I've never seen it, or I've never heard from anyone I know that they sleepwalk. So to me, it seems like this wives' tale or this like legend. Maybe someone's listening and like they're getting upset because they actually sleepwalk and it causes problems. But is it real sleepwalking? I don't know. It's unconfirmed. And now on to the most interesting stage of sleep, in my opinion, which is REM sleep, or rapid eye movement sleep. So I want to start by saying that during these different sleep stages, the EOG, which again is measuring this eye movement, it goes from being awake, which kind of looks like rapid waves, and you can kind of see these waves, and it goes to flat when you're in N1, even flatter when you're in N2, and then very flat when you're in N3. It's like no eye movement. And then all of a sudden, you go into REM sleep, and now it looks as though you're awake. Like if I was just looking at the EOG, I'd see those waves come back and I'd say, wait, this person's awake. But really, they are in REM sleep. So REM sleep is characterized by increased eye movement and increased brain activity. Your brainwaves actually look fairly similar to alpha waves, as if you were awake, again, kind of like the EOG and the eye movement. You also have increased breathing rate, you have an increased heart rate. However, the one thing that stays fairly constant here is that the skeletal muscle activity is still low. So that EMG that's measuring that skeletal muscle activity that's attached to the chin, it would look similar throughout these different sleep stages. In fact, in N2 and N3, it decreases from N1, where you're still having a few twitches and you're catching those. It decreases more and more and stays fairly constant from N3 to REM. And this is important, right? Because if your skeletal muscles were to be activated while you're in a dream, you might act out that dream and cause harm to yourself or others. And that's another thing I should mention about REM sleep. That's the main stage where you dream. It's pretty rare that you dream in non-REM sleep, but it does happen. But the REM is like the main time you dream. And the REM stage of sleep starts out lasting about 10 minutes for the first sleep cycle, and then progressively gets longer and longer for the sleep cycles after the first. So you start out at maybe 10 minutes for the first sleep cycle, then maybe 20 for the next. And then by the last cycle, you have a REM stage that is about an hour long. And this brings me to my next very important point, which is that sleep is a cycle, right? It's a cycle that repeats somewhere between 5 and 6 times a night for an adult. And of course, depends upon how much sleep you're getting. If you're only sleeping for an hour, you're not going to go through 5 or 6 sleep cycles. And what's interesting to me is that it does not repeat the same stages with each cycle. So as the cycle progresses, you go from the first to the second to the third, you're losing some of these non-REM sleep stages. So for instance, let's just say that your first 2 sleep cycles you go through are normal. You do N1, then you go to N2, then you go to N3, then you go to REM. Well, then say for the third sleep cycle, you actually lose N3. So now you go from N1 to N2, then to REM. And that's your third cycle. Now on your fourth cycle, let's say that you lose N2. So now on your fourth cycle, you're just going from N1 straight into REM. And the reason, or I guess I like to think the reason that the REM stage of each cycle gets longer and longer is that you're losing these non-REM stages. And I just like to think, okay, well, I'm just throwing the amount of time that I would have been in that non-REM stage into the REM stage, and that's why that's getting longer. And there's these beautiful diagrams that show this process. They look essentially like a step function where it's showing kind of your alertness level and which stage you're in and how long each of these stages are. I would just Google like sleep cycles and search images. And if you're kind of unfamiliar with what a sleep cycle is, or you're not getting this idea of these stages repeating over and over and how that's a cycle, just go look at these images. It really helps me, and hopefully that'll help you too. All right, so back to REM sleep. So as I said, REM sleep is typically where dreams are had. Very rarely do you have dreams in non-REM sleep. And that got me kind of thinking, how often do people actually have dreams? Is it on a nightly basis? Is it on a daily basis? I guess those are the same. But I can't even remember the last time I had a dream. So as thinking of that, I kind of looked into it a little bit. And according to Margarita Tartakovsky, who is a clinical psychologist, we actually probably dream every night. The thing is, though, that we don't really remember the dreams that we had every night. And therefore, to us, it seems like we don't dream every night, which might seem pretty obvious to you. And maybe you already know that. But to me, that's really interesting and just kind of makes me sad that I can't remember all my dreams. I wish I did, and I think it'd be fun. So to kind of wrap all that up, there are 4 sleep stages, N1, N2, N3, and REM, and those occur in several cycles throughout the night. An EEG measures electrical activity in the brain, and as you go from being awake to N1 to N2 to N3, these waves or this electrical activity in the brain actually slows down, right? You go from alpha waves to theta, then to delta in N3. And what's interesting though is as soon as you reach the REM stage of sleep, the brain waves actually look fairly similar to as if you were awake. In terms of EMG, it measures muscle activity, and this muscle activity decreases as you get further and further into the sleep stages. It maintains its low activity in the REM stage of sleep, which prevents you from acting out your dreams. And this inhibition of muscle contraction seen during REM sleep is called atonia. Then lastly, you have EOG, which captures eye movement and is particularly important for capturing the rapid eye movement that is characteristic of REM sleep.
Thanks for checking out the Prospective Doctor MCAT Basics podcast. Sam's doing a killer job taking you through the most important MCAT topics, but what if you need a little extra help? How does a 5, 10, or even 15-point increase in your score sound? Imagine how your chances at admission could increase. Med School Coach's MCAT tutoring can get you there. With the most rigorous selection process of any tutoring company, we see amazing results. We deconstruct each student, find a plan that is going to work, and help execute it. That's why our students add an average 12 points to their score. Completely physician-run and operated, and focusing on nothing but medicine. It's no wonder over 10,000 past students have trusted Med School Coach to get them through the MCAT and into medical school. Check out medschoolcoach.com today and mention code PODCAST for 5% off.
In the next part of this podcast, I want to talk about circadian rhythms. So circadian rhythms are physical, mental, and behavioral changes that follow a daily cycle. Cyclical release of hormones is an example of a circadian rhythm. So for instance, melatonin is secreted in a cyclical manner by the pineal gland. Plasma cortisol levels follow a cyclical pattern. Body temperature is another example of a circadian rhythm. It tends to be lowest at the beginning of the day, then it increases throughout the day, and then as you sleep, decreases until you wake up in the morning. In order for something to be a circadian rhythm, it must meet 3 criteria. First, it must be endogenously generated, meaning that it must be generated inside of the body and that it is not a response to the environment. As Kim Lee and Duffy say in an article in the Journal of Clinical Outcomes Management, quote, "These circadian rhythms are not a simple response to environmental changes associated with day and night. They are intrinsic to the organism," end quote. Another way you can think about this, and the way I like to think about this, is that if you were to place somebody in a dark room, strap them to a table, then these things that are circadian rhythms would still be occurring, right? Because you don't need some kind of external signal for the circadian rhythms to occur. Second, in order for something to be a circadian rhythm, it must be entrainable. And all it means for something to be entrainable is that it can be synchronized with environmental cues. So I think one of the easiest ways to understand what this means is to think about how all of our circadian rhythms, at least the majority of them, are in line with the light-dark cycle that we experience every day. Take body temperature, for example. It decreases to a minimum right when we wake up, and then throughout the day it increases steadily, and then as it gets dark and as we go to sleep, it starts to decrease again, and it cycles that way forever, really, forever that you're alive. Now, if you were to move from Colorado to Japan, let's say, your body would experience a big change in terms of the light-dark cycle, right? It would be light at a much different time in Japan than it was in Colorado, and dark much in the same way. So what happens is that your body's able to compensate, and you still have these circadian rhythms. You're only shifting the peaks and the troughs of these circadian rhythms to align with the light-dark cycle that you're now in. If you're a math guy or gal like me, you could also think about this in terms of like a sine wave, right? So a sine wave is just this periodic wave, and you can shift the phase on this sine wave by adding an integer to the variable that is being operated upon by the sine wave. So it would be like sine of x versus sine of, in parentheses, x plus 4, end parenthesis. And all that's doing is that's shifting the wave to the right or the left. In the same way, you can move these circadian rhythms around a bit depending upon different external signals such as light-dark cycle. And that is what's called being entrainable. The third criteria of a circadian rhythm is that it must be temperature compensated, meaning that the cycle is maintained over a range of physiological temperatures. So in other words, if you're outside in the hot, you still have a circadian rhythm. If you're at the cold, you still have the circadian rhythm. That one's fairly easy to understand. So again, the 3 criteria of a circadian rhythm are: number 1, it's endogenously generated; number 2, it is entrainable; and number 3, it compensates for temperature. And I think all that can be summed up by the following example. You are abducted, unfortunately, and you are strapped to a table in a dark room. Well, during this, lucky you, your circadian rhythms are still going to be oscillating over a 24-hour period. And then once you were released, because you're going to get saved, these circadian rhythms would then sync up with the light-dark cycle that you were subsequently exposed to. The next thing I want to talk about here is how the circadian rhythm is established, or how all these different circadian rhythms are established. And the short answer is that they're established by the suprachiasmatic nucleus, which I talked about a little bit earlier, is a bundle of neurons located in the hypothalamus. And it's a bundle of about 20,000 neurons, so it's pretty small. In size aside, its name is pretty badass. It sounds like a superhero or something. Suprachiasmatic nucleus. Anyways, this nucleus has cells in its dorsomedial region that have an endogenous 24-hour rhythm. It's essentially our body's biological clock. In addition to containing these cells that act as our biological clock, the suprachiasmatic nucleus also sends out signals to other glands to tell them to keep secreting hormones in a cyclical manner. It's essentially communicating to these glands, hey, here's the instructions for maintaining this circadian rhythm. So for example, it signals the pineal gland and tells it to release melatonin in a cyclical manner. And it also signals the adrenal gland, telling it when to produce cortisol. And melatonin and cortisol are both pretty interesting compounds. So I want to talk a little bit further about each of those. So as I said, melatonin is secreted from the pineal gland, and melatonin is actually synthesized from serotonin, which is derived from tryptophan. And you better know what tryptophan looks like. It's an amino acid, and it's got that 2-ring structure. So the suprachiasmatic nucleus receives signals from the eye when it's light out, and this signal is then sent to the spinal cord, where it travels to the superior cervical ganglia, and then it travels from there back to the pineal gland, where it inhibits the release of melatonin. And obviously you don't want melatonin to be around when it's light out, because melatonin makes you sleepy. You want melatonin to be released when it's dark out, which makes sense, right? As it gets darker, you don't get this signal coming in to the pineal gland telling it to suppress its melatonin production. So instead it starts making melatonin, and in turn that makes you sleepy and you fall asleep. And hopefully you're thinking right now, hey, that doesn't sound like an endogenously generated signal. And from what I just said, you're right, it doesn't sound like that. But what we do know is that you can take someone who is blind and therefore does not have these photons coming into their eye getting transmitted to the brain. You can have this person still have melatonin released in this cyclical manner, and therefore is a circadian rhythm. What this light does is it helps entrain the release of melatonin. And so what you'll see in people that are blind in some cases is that the release of melatonin does not correspond quite as well with the light-dark cycle. And so these people might end up getting a little bit sleepier at certain times of the day, more awake maybe in the night. But what was interesting to me is when I was reading an article about this, there is a significant proportion of people that are blind and actually have this melatonin release entrained with the light-dark cycle. So maybe it's something in behavior that is able to actually act to entrain the melatonin release. I don't know. But to me, that was very interesting. So cortisol is secreted from the adrenal glands, which sit on top of the kidneys, and it is a steroid hormone. So it's synthesized from cholesterol, like all steroid hormones. And essentially what occurs in the case of cortisol is that the suprachiasmatic nucleus in the hypothalamus stimulates the pituitary to secrete adrenocorticotropic hormone, which, if you think back to the hormones podcast, or what was it, endocrine system podcast, tropic hormones are hormones that go and affect other glands. So in this case, the pituitary secretes this adrenocorticotropic hormone that goes and binds to its receptor on the adrenal gland, and this actually stimulates the release of cortisol. Cortisol levels in the plasma follow a cyclical pattern because they are a circadian rhythm. So they are at peak levels around 7 or 8 a.m., and then they fall throughout the day until they reach almost undetectable levels by about 7 p.m. And then around midnight, they pick back up and they increase until they reach a peak again around about 7 a.m. And as you can probably guess by when cortisol levels peak, cortisol corresponds to feeling awake. So as they decrease, right, you start to get more sleepy, which is good because you want to go to bed. It's also when you start secreting melatonin, as I just talked about, and that will put you to sleep. And one thing that's kind of interesting to me is I've heard people say, oh, don't drink your first cup of coffee till around 9 or 10 a.m. when your cortisol levels first start to drop, right? Because they're peaking around 7 or 8 when most people wake up. So why would you drink coffee then if you are feeling most awake? And those people might have a point, but I can tell you that I've never really felt most awake at 6 or 7 a.m. when I just wake up. So I'll keep having my 7 a.m. cup of coffee. All right, so before I get into the psychology part of this podcast, let me just kind of wrap up what I've said about circadian rhythms. So number one, what you should take away is that circadian rhythms are endogenous and trainable cyclical patterns in the human body. And number two, the circadian clock or the biological clock is a bundle of neurons that sits in the hypothalamus called the suprachiasmatic nucleus. And these act sort of similarly to pacemaker cells where they kind of have their own endogenous beat, so to speak. And these are what helps set the circadian rhythms in the body. In this next part of the podcast, I want to cover some psychology topics regarding sleep. So I'll cover sleep and dream theories, I'll talk about sleep disorders, and then lastly, I will shortly go over the effects of different drug classes on sleep. The first thing that I want to talk about here are some different sleep theories that try to answer the age-old question, why do we sleep? And the truth is, at the end of this, you're not going to have any clear idea of why we sleep because in reality, we don't know. But there's some interesting theories as to why we do sleep. So the first theory is called the restoration theory and states that we undergo cellular repair as we sleep. And there's a bit of evidence for this theory. For instance, human growth hormone, insulin, cortisol, hunger, and sympathetic nervous system regulation are all disrupted when we are deprived of sleep. The second theory that I'm going to talk about is called energy conservation theory and states that we conserve energy while we sleep due to the fact that we're unconscious and obviously we have a very low metabolic rate when we're sleeping. The third theory is called inactivation theory, and it's more of an evolutionary perspective on why we sleep, and it holds that, quote, the night was a dangerous place for our ancestors and less food was readily available then. So, individuals that moved around less at night were more likely to survive, and this is what led to sleep, end quote. The fourth theory is called the memory consolidation theory and states that sleep is necessary for transferring memories from short-term storage into long-term storage. The fifth theory is called brain plasticity theory, and this one's interesting. It's fairly similar to the memory consolidation theory, but it states that sleep is necessary because it allows our brains to develop through changes in neuroplasticity. And for those of you that don't know or are unfamiliar with the term neuroplasticity, it refers to the brain's ability to change and adapt as a result of an experience. And what underlies this neuroplasticity is the ability of neurons to modify the strength and efficiency of synaptic transmission over time. And the sixth and final theory on sleep that I'm going to talk about, and my personal favorite, is the theory that you can sleep when you die. So study harder. Let's talk now about dream theories. And again, you're not going to get a solid answer as to why we dream because it's still up in the air question. And there's a lot of interesting theories, starting with Freud's theory. And because it's Freud, you know it's going to be some weird shit. But he theorized that our dreams are our unconscious desires. He further contended that some dreams can disguise their true meaning. So essentially, he's saying that dreams have some deeper meaning that represent our unconscious desires. And he broke the content of dreams down into two categories: the manifest portion of a dream and the latent portion of a dream. The manifest content of the dream is literally what's going on in the dream. So for example, I have this reoccurring nightmare that I am laid prone by a group of small people. And by small people, I mean like literally like action figure sized people. And my dream is that these people are strapping me down and then hammering a iron rod into my head. And I don't know why this recurring nightmare occurs, but what Freud would say is that the manifest part of his dream is exactly that, what's going on. Now, he also broke down dreams into their latent content, and he described the latent content as kind of like the hidden meaning of the dream. So Freud might look at this nightmare of mine and say, okay, well, this represents some idea that you've had implanted in your head by someone else. And, you're having cognitive dissonance holding this thought inside your head and you need to get rid of it. And of course, Freud being Freud, he also focused on sexual desires and symbolism in dreams. So for example, he believed that cylindrical objects in dreams represented penises, whereas caves or invaginations represented vaginas. And another example that I saw was that if someone were to have a dream, for instance, that a train was going into a tunnel, he would say, well, you were dreaming about sex. The second theory as to why we dream is called threat simulation theory, and it is an evolutionary perspective on dreaming. And it says that having dreams was an advantage for our ancestors and that it allowed them to essentially train in responding to threats. So, say that one of our ancestors was dreaming about crossing paths with a lion and fending off that lion. Well, this theory would say that this dream allowed this individual to actually train for a situation that they might encounter. And now, say this individual actually encountered the situation where they came upon a lion in real life. Well, now they're better trained to actually defeat that lion. And this allowed individuals to live longer than those who would not dream. And so there was an evolutionary advantage to dreaming. And of course, in the context of my reoccurring nightmare, this theory doesn't make much sense. I'm never going to be fighting these action figure-sized people ever in my life. Hopefully not, at least. The next theory I want to talk about is called the activation synthesis hypothesis. And it was developed by Hobson and McCarley. And it suggests that dreams are simply the brain's way of making sense of the random electrical impulses that are produced during REM sleep. And of course, this theory I like because it makes me more comfortable about having my reoccurring nightmare. Maybe that dream doesn't mean anything. It was just my brain trying to make sense of these crazy waves that are being produced during REM sleep. The fourth and final dream theory that I'm going to talk about is called the Cartwright theory and was developed by Rosalind Cartwright. And she believed that dreams simply reflect life events that are important to the dreamer. And Cartwright herself developed some empirical evidence that backed up her theory. So what she did is she took a group of women that were going through divorce and she woke them up during REM sleep and asked them to report their dreams. And what she noticed is that these women that were about to get divorced often dreamed of their significant other that they were being divorced from. She went on to essentially show that there was a positive correlation between the amount of time someone would spend thinking about their spouse and the number of times the spouse actually showed up in their dream. The next thing I want to talk about here are some common sleep disorders. And I've seen these come up on some MCAT practice exams, so I wanted to go over some of the broad categories of sleep disorders. So there are a few broad categories of sleep disorders that I think are important to understand. The first being insomnias, the second being breathing-related sleep disorders, and the third being hypersomnolence or hyperinsomnia-related disorders. Insomnias are a repeated difficulty with sleep initiation, duration, consolidation, or quality that occurs despite adequate opportunity and circumstances for sleep, and results in some form of daytime impairment, like being too sleepy to drive, falling asleep places you shouldn't be, not being able to pay attention. Breathing-related sleep disorders are just what they sound like. It's having trouble breathing while you're sleeping. And one of the most common forms of a breathing-related sleep disorder is sleep apnea. And there are multiple types of sleep apnea stemming from multiple causes. So there is central sleep apnea, obstructive sleep apnea, and complex sleep apnea. So central sleep apnea is caused by dysfunction of the central nervous system in sending signals to the muscles that control breathing while you sleep. This is essentially holding your breath during sleeping from some dysfunction of the central nervous system, hence central sleep apnea. Obstructive sleep apnea occurs when your throat muscles momentarily relax during sleep, which causes your airways to be blocked. And this is the most common form of sleep apnea. Complex sleep apnea is someone who has both central and obstructive sleep apnea syndromes. In hypersomnolence or hypersomnia-related disorders, the primary complaint is daytime sleepiness not caused by disturbed nocturnal sleep or misaligned circadian rhythms. So essentially, this is where you're getting enough sleep, but then you are really sleepy during the day. An example of a hypersomnia-related disorder is narcolepsy, and that is someone who has spontaneous attacks of sleep. So that's like the classic person just falling asleep, while they're standing or walking that you might see in movies or something like that. Before I get into the effect that drugs have on sleep, let me just kind of wrap up everything I've said. So overall, we don't know why we sleep or why we have dreams, but there's plenty of theories that try to explain why we do. And what I would know in terms of sleep disorders is I would obviously know the difference between central and obstructive sleep apnea. And then I would know that insomnia is trouble falling asleep, whereas hypersomnia or hypersomnolence is trouble staying awake. So the last thing I want to talk about here is a little short bit on the effect of different types of drugs on sleep. So there's many different categories of drugs, from opiates to depressants, stimulants, hallucinogens, so forth. And all of these drugs have a bit of a different effect on sleep. So starting with opiates, this is things like morphine, fentanyl, and various other painkillers. They tend to be disruptive to REM sleep as well as the deeper levels of sleep like stage 3 or N3 of sleep. Depressants inhibit the function of the central nervous system. This is barbiturates, benzodiazepines, and alcohol. And because they inhibit the function of the central nervous system, they actually cause you to sleep more. And a lot of the medications that are used to treat sleep disorders that I just talked about are considered depressants. Stimulants like cocaine, amphetamines, and caffeine have adverse effects on sleep and can cause insomnia. Caffeine's an interesting one, and I'm just talking about it because I'm sure a lot of you take caffeine on a regular basis, as do I, and caffeine acts as an adenosine antagonist. What it does is it binds to the adenosine receptor in the brain and blocks adenosine from actually binding to it, and therefore blocking its effects. And remember, what adenosine essentially does is it binds to receptors in neurons in the basal forebrain and blocks the release of acetylcholine, which makes us sleepy, because acetylcholine makes us feel awake. The effect of hallucinogens on sleep varies depending upon the drug. THC, which is considered a lot of different things. One of the things it's considered is a hallucinogen, tends to reduce REM sleep and increases the length of the light sleeping stages like N1 and N2. So that was just a brief primer on the effects of some of the drug classes on sleep. And that also concludes this podcast on sleep and circadian rhythms. I hope you found this podcast helpful. And as always, if you like what we do, go leave us a review on iTunes. I love seeing it. As I said in the intro, I saw a very funny shout out on Twitter. So thanks for that. I like seeing those. Those make me laugh. Good luck to those of you who are taking the test soon, and look out for the next podcast.
Thanks for listening to Prospective Doctor's MCAT podcast. If you're a pre-med, you'll want to check out prospectivedoctor.com for tons of free tools, articles, and more podcasts that cover your pre-med life. And if you need help on the MCAT or getting into med school, check